What's up everybody, I'm Scott from Stringjoy Guitar Strings, and today we're talking about something I've been meaning to talk about forever. Like seriously, this has been on my video list for years. We're talking about Jimi Hendrix's guitar string gauges. Now, as you probably know, literally everything about the gear that Jimi Hendrix has used has been researched to death and reported about to death, and I think it's definitely worth noting that Jimi Hendrix was not the sum of his gear. Like most guitar players, he was a great player, and that's what mattered the most. He did use the gear that was available to him at the time, and interestingly, I think he was using a lot of innovative gear. So if Jimi Hendrix was around today, he'd probably be using Strymons on his whole board. He wasn't a classicist the way that I think we kind of think. He was using pedals that were kind of brand new in order to make sounds that felt, you know, the most kind of cutting edge to him. So I've always found that fascinating because a lot of people that really obsess about Jimi's gear, you know, have this idea that things were perfect in the 60s, when in reality, I don't think even he, if he was alive today, would tell you that at all. So a little bit of backstory on the Stringjoy side. So I, back in 2015, wrote an article about Jimi Hendrix's guitar string gauges, really short and sweet. And that article was like the first thing we had that really took off from our blog. I'd found this info, I can't even remember, I think from an interview in Guitar World with Roger Mayer, and wrote about it. And at the time, it wasn't really a super well-known thing about Hendrix's gauges. And we got to play a big part in that becoming something people were made more aware of. And since then, you know, there's been a bunch of other articles written kind of saying the same thing. But that was kind of fun to be a part of. Definitely I was doing that when I was a little bit more naive. But anyway, let's jump on in and talk about the actual string gauges. That's enough about me. So a few little notes before we talk about the gauges themselves. For one, Hendrix was using round core pure nickel strings, not because he thought that was better than hex core. Hex core wasn't really around back then, so he was using the strings that were available. Nothing really more to it than that. But we did today use our Stringjoy Broadways, which are our round core pure nickel line, in order to kind of, as close as possible, approximate the actual, you know, tone and sound of his strings. It's also worth noting that back then, on round core pure nickel strings, they used really heavy cores and thin wrap, which sounds bad, but steel's a lot cheaper than nickel, and so that's why they did it, to have more of the gauge made up by steel and less made up with nickel. Just cost-saving stuff. When we tried to kind of duplicate those vintage strings, they do not actually sound good, which is kind of interesting. All right, so the gauges themselves. Starting with the high E, he was going with a 10, pretty standard. Next up, a 13. That's really common in a lot of light sets that you see these days. The third string is where it first gets interesting. He uses a 15, which is quite a bit lighter than the 10 and the 13, so it's a super flexible G on this set. Then moving on beyond that to the D, he's using a 26. Again, that's pretty normal these days on a set of 10s. On the A string, he's using a 32, which is pretty light versus like a 36 like you might normally see. And then the lightest of all is the low E. He's using a 38 gauge low E string, where you might typically these days see anywhere from, you know, a 42 up to a 50 or whatever. So it's an odd balance, this set. You have some strings that are pretty normal in terms of tension, and a couple, like the G and that low E and the A to a lesser extent, that are super light and really flexible, and they're not necessarily where you'd expect. You know, it makes sense to have a really bendable G, but having a really bendable low E is a little bit interesting. So why did he use these exact gauges when they're kind of funky like that? There's a lot of thought out there, and if you hang out on internet forums where all the experts hang out, the pretty common explanation is that because he had a reverse headstock, there was longer string length behind the nut on the low E, and so he used a lighter gauge because that longer string length would give you more tension. Now that sounds good, but it's not true. We generally ignore length behind the nut and behind the bridge when we're calculating guitar string tension. Beyond that, what you really would actually see is that you'd have a different break angle, which would affect the tension because less string or more string can go over the nut or the bridge. The length doesn't matter nearly as much, except insofar as it affects the break angle over the nut or the bridge. So no matter what you hear, it's not that, or not at least as far as I know. What we do know is some info that we got from Roger Mayer, who was Jimi Hendrix's guitar tech, and also a brilliant engineer who made a lot of really cool guitar effects. The Octavia is a super favorite one of mine, but all in all, a pretty brilliant man when it comes to gear. So we have a quote from him that he gave in an interview that I think is kind of our best opening into why these string string gauges were chosen. All right, so I'm going to read this quote from Roger Mayer. I have it over here on my computer. He says, "The big difference is that you're using the 15 for the third, like we talked about, because if you use the 17 for the third, the actual sound of the guitar is very G-heavy." Now, I'm going to interject on these quotes here. I agree with him. Having a plain third when you have a 17 can get a little bit wonky, especially if you get up to like an 18, 19, or a 20. The G really does stand out. If you listen to your guitar, you can probably hear it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just, you know, a feature of the instrument. But that is why a lot of players, myself included, really like using wound thirds a lot. It tends to make the guitar a little bit less G-heavy, more like an acoustic guitar where it blends a little bit better. So let's continue on over here. So Roger says, "The electrical output of the strings is dependent on the square of the diameter. If you square all the diameters and look at them, you can get much more of an idea about the balance of the guitar." Now that is not true. I'm not sure why he got the idea that the square was so important. The diameter of a string is, I mean, it's the diameter, it's a round string, so you don't square it to get any information about, you know, I'm not sure if he was looking for the area or what, which you would use pi. Squaring it, you know, wouldn't really have a big effect unless you had, you know, a square string. So I really don't understand where he's coming from with that, but let's continue. He said, "You should always remember that because many, many times people use a set of strings that are completely imbalanced," I agree, "and they just don't sound that good. Most people would say a 10 to 13 is the correct jump, and the 15 is much better for the G than a 17, and 15 squares out at 0.225, and 17 is 0.289. So you're going to get 28% more output just with a 2-pound difference in string size." Okay, so also don't know where he's getting any of that from. You know, and not to hate, Roger Mayer is a brilliant engineer and made some really, really interesting effect pedals and innovations in guitar gear in general. But in terms of that reasoning for this gauge of string, it doesn't really make a ton of sense. You know, you have adjustable pole pieces on an electric guitar. You can adjust any gauge of string to sound balanced if you move the pole pieces around so that the electrical output is all kind of in balance. And this certainly isn't a tension balanced set of strings at all. I mean, not at all. It's a very unbalanced set of strings. So I really don't know why he would have chosen this set of strings. But one thing that I do know is that there was a Fender set of strings at the same time. And again, there's kind of some hot debate here, like there is with all Jimi Hendrix gear, because there was a Fender set that went 10, 13, 15, 26, 32, 38, exact same gauges. But Roger Mayer claims here that this is a custom set that he built for a specific reason. So it's possible these were independent. There's not necessarily a bunch of evidence that Jimi was using Fender strings. He was using a bunch of different brands of strings, in fact. He'd go to Europe and use strings that were available over there, and same story here in America. So he wasn't loyal to any particular brand, and certainly not, you know, those Fenders as far as we know. So maybe they were developed independently for different reasons. Maybe Fender took the idea from Jimi, or Jimi took it from... I really have no idea. I was not alive, as you can probably tell. But we do know that those existed, and we do know that, at least according to Roger Mayer, this was an intentionally chosen gauge of strings specifically for Jimi, and had a big effect on his playing. So yeah, here on this Strat where we've got this 10 to 38 set, it's definitely interesting. You've got a lot more spank to that low E, and then a lot of spank on the A too. And the D's, you know, a little bit less so than you would expect given the E and the A. So it definitely gives you some bright snappiness to those strings. And the thing that I noticed the most is that G, you can like bend it way higher than you would really need to. In fact, you kind of have to adjust so that you're not over bending. But yeah, it's a little bit weird. You have a very flexible G that makes it really easy to bend that string, which I think he probably would have made pretty good use of. So I, as you probably have inferred by now, am not Jimi Hendrix, and I do not pretend to be Jimi Hendrix. I can't play anything like the man. That's not the style of guitar that I came up playing anyway. But for kicks, I'll do a little bit, because I know if I don't, there'll be some points in the comments about not playing any Hendrix. All right, so that's the only Hendrix song that I remember learning, and I have not played it in 20 years or whatever. I actually had to look up that Hendrix chord, which is a pretty cool chord, I have to admit. So that was fun. I never thought I would play Purple Haze on the internet. So that's, you know, what are you gonna do? So if you want to try out this set of strings, a custom set's a good way to do it. Our Broadways in a 10, 13, 15, 26, 32, 38 are a great way to get kind of that authentic vintage Jimmy thing. There are a couple different companies selling these same gauge sets. That'll get you there too. I would recommend going for like a round core pure nickel if you really want to have the true experience. A lot of companies sell this gauge in like a standard hex core nickel plated steel, which will give you the same gauge experience, but not, you know, authentic to what it would have been. Now, obviously, this gauge of guitar string is not going to make you play anything like Jimi Hendrix. And just because it was right for him doesn't mean it's necessarily right for you. I think finding your own particular gauge of strings that work for you the way this worked for him is always the better solution. But there's always a lot of fun about, you know, stringing up the strings that your heroes would have actually played, feeling what that actually sounds like and plays like, and seeing if, you know, you get any of that voodoo that he had. So I definitely recommend playing around with it if you like. Just build a custom set, install it, and you know, you'll be off to the races.